In this series of videos, we're going to talk about Chapter 8, which is about the Slutsky equations. Maybe I'll just underline this. And so in this chapter, what we're really going to do is explore this relationship between price changes, or price, and quantity demanded. So this chapter explores the relationship between price and quantity demanded. So quantity demanded. And so, we might think that if price, P1 goes up, then quantity demanded of that good, or the optimal amount of, let's say, good 1 would go down. But not always the case. But this is not always the case. This is not always the case. We could have, it's possible with well-behaved functions, well-behaved preferences, that when the price goes up, the quantity demanded of good 1 actually goes up as well. We saw this kind of before with given goods. And x1 to go up, so the amount of good 1 to go up. Remember we talked about this with given goods. And while given goods are mainly theoretical, that seems a little bit crazy. But we can probably think of a few instances where that might be true, right? So let's say that can make sense for some situations. So it's mainly theoretical. It seems maybe a bit crazy when the price of a good goes up and the quantity, the optimum amount of that good that we want to purchase goes up. And it's mainly theoretical, but we do see situations where maybe this makes a little bit more sense. So for example, what if your wages went from $15 an hour, so right around minimum wage, to $50 an hour? Would you increase or decrease the amount of work that you did, the amount of leisure that you had? What about $10,000 an hour? So we can see that, maybe when our wages first go up a little bit, maybe we start, having less leisure and start working more because we want to take advantage of these higher wages. But we might also realize we only need a certain amount of money, and then we really value leisure at some point. And so maybe if your wages become $10,000 an hour, you want to maybe work, less than you did when you were getting $15 an hour, because you just have to work less hours to get the kind of income that you want. And so here's a situation where we might think that, we could have these given goods or something like that. Good changing. We don't kind of really know for sure if the quantity demand is going to go up or down of that good when the price of that good goes up or down. Well, this is because there's kind of two things that are happening when we change the price. There's two effects that are happening, the income and the substitution effect. So let's kind of write some of that down. So there's two effects. So when the price of a good changes, there are two effects. The substitution effect and the income effect. So The substitution effect is basically the change in consumption because the relative prices of the goods have changed. So if you change the price of one good, so for example, if good one, if its price increased, then it's relatively more expensive than it used to be compared to good two. And so we're going to adjust some of our consumption because of that relative price change. Now the other thing that's happening that maybe is a little harder to imagine when you first start thinking about it is that there's actually a change in income, or in a sense, a change in purchasing power when we change the price of a good. So for instance, if the price of good one went down, we could afford more of both goods. The price of good went up, we can afford less of both goods. So there's a change in our purchasing power, a change in our real income when one of the prices changes. And so what we're going to try to do in this chapter is basically like disentangle these two effects. So we have like a total change in how much of good one we want to purchase. And we want to kind of isolate the effects of the relative price change from the effects of the change in purchasing power. So that's the idea that we're going to kind of go through. And we're going to do that like algebraically, we can do that with graphics, etc. Like a graph, I mean. So let's talk about the sub effect first. So this is the substitution effect. A change in the price of a good changes the rate that you can exchange one good for another. Rate at which you exchange one good for another. So in other words, it kind of changes the rate at which you give up one good to get a bit more of the other good, right? So this is like just a relative price change. And what we're going to do here is we're always, well, we'll talk about this a little bit later in a future video, but we're always going to substitute towards the good that got cheaper. The good that got relatively cheaper. So we always kind of know the direction of this substitution effect. So if the price of good one goes down, we're going to both have the substitution and the income effect, but the substitution effect is going to make us purchase more of good one because it got relatively cheaper. If the price of good one went up, it got relatively more expensive. So we're going to substitute away from good one and towards good two. That's me pointing to the axes there. Okay, so let's erase this and we can talk about the income effect next. So that first effect was the substitution. The second, as we've been saying, is the income effect. The change in price, as I was saying before, also changes the purchasing power. Purchasing power of the income, purchasing power of the budget, or income, M. So for instance, if the price of good one goes down, then we can afford more of both goods. I'm going to just switch colors here because I'm running out of juice in this one. Or less. Both goods. Oops. Both goods. And so essentially, like the total change in consumption or purchase equals the income effect plus the substitution effect. And so essentially what we want to do is we kind of saw before, we mapped out how price changes affect total consumption. So we saw that kind of last chapter when we looked at demand. But now we want to think about, well, how do I decompose this total change in consumption to these two different effects? One that's being caused in the relative price change, and one that's being caused in how my purchasing power changed as a result of these price changes. So we want to decompose total change in consumption or purchasing into the income and substitution effects. So that's what we want to do here. And so let's quickly erase here and think about the idea, like how we're going to try to go about doing this. And there's actually a couple different ways of actually isolating the substitution effect. If you had me in first year, or if you looked at the appendix in your first year text, there was like a certain way of calculating the substitution effect. That's actually the Hicksian substitution effect. We're going to look at a slightly different one, which is like the Slutsky substitution effect. Though we're going to talk about the Hickson in a little bit as well.